David Nickles is I guess, a wonderful hybrid of an activist as well as a psychedelicist as well as a cannabist.
That works.
David is very active in really spending a lot of time critiquing what's going on in different sort of plant communities, rather than just the usual sort of hurrah crowd going, this is all great. And I actually don't even know what you're talking about today.
Well,
I'm just joking. No, David, I guess in keeping with the theme of legalization, of changes and regulation and things that are going on, it's definitely a big theme that we're running across the whole weekend. David's going to share with us really some, I guess, insights into what's been going on in the USA. So thank you very much. Take it away.
Totally. I have to say it was a little surprising to hear Kat say she didn't know what I was going to be talking about, because we had been talking for a while about the corporate terrain in the States, and as we were sort of leading up to MardiGrass, we'd been kicking back and forth a whole bunch of ideas around how to address sort of the be careful what you wish for aspect of legalization and criminalization, and people's urgency to get out of the situation that they're in without maybe considering the full implications of where we might be going. And so we had been talking about digging into the corporate controlled cannabis landscape in the US, or increasingly corporate controlled. And so as I started to kind of dig into that, it became apparent to me that the issues went even beyond the corporatization of cannabis, and that a lot of the problems that were being encountered along the lines of corporate control and along the lines of commodification and even just legalization in general weren't just about the corporate interests that were increasingly dominating the field, as much as they were about the systemic problems and institutions and power structures within the broader US. So as I started digging into a lot of the ongoing news reports about problems with cannabis corporatization, the picture that emerged was one where I saw that we have a lot in common with folks who are dealing with unjust power structures more broadly, and that if we want to address some of the problems with corporate cannabis, it really goes beyond cannabis. So when it comes to the wonderful worlds of weed, one of the things I find is that when you come to events like this and you talk with different people, it seems like different people have things that they're very much excited about. That events like this, I think, are kind of special because you get this coalescing of people who are all very passionate about a topic that has a whole bunch of different aspects to it. And so, when we look at what brings people to cannabis, and particularly to cannabis activism, we find that there's a wide variety of categories, from things like health benefits and all of the research that exists. I know the last presentation was talking about some of this. Google Scholar is a great place to sort of put in keywords tied to cannabis and see what sort of peer-reviewed papers you can find. There are a huge number of health benefits, both to people who are at what we might consider to be a fairly normal or standard level of functioning as human beings, but also to people who are struggling with a wide variety of health problems, both physical ailments, mental ailments. And so there's a huge cross-section of folks who are very enthused about legalization, owing to their intersection of health issues and cannabis. Additionally, if we look at industrial manufacturing, we can see that there's a wide variety of problems that cannabis can address, from the sort of textiles and we can call it sustainable production of paper goods and fibers and rope, to chemical applications, the replacement of certain petrochemical based plastics and things of that nature. Certain processing procedures can be substituted with cannabis products. And I think as exciting as a lot of the industrial cannabis and hemp applications are, it's also important to be mindful of the fact that when we're talking about sustainability in relationship to industrial technologies and processing and the production of goods, right? That it's not just about what the raw materials are, it's about all of the wastes and all of the processes necessary to create the materials that we as human beings in society are using. So again, as we get excited about all of the things that cannabis can replace, I think there's also important questions of, how many of these products do we really need on the marketplace when we look at the state of the world and ecological catastrophe? Is it good enough to just replace products with cannabis-based products, or do we need to sort of have a larger consideration about why we're seeing such rampant production and consumption in the first place? I would assume everybody here is more or less familiar with the shifts in cognition that cannabis can facilitate, whether you're talking about medical issues, as we already covered, or just the idea of being able to take a moment for yourself, perhaps to smoke some weed and enjoy a walk in nature. Or I know people who use it as part of their relationship techniques, and that perhaps when they find themselves getting into a rather heated debate, they'll take a moment and smoke and see if that can sort of offer them some space to recontextualize, reconsider, and navigate the disputes they're having because of how it makes them sort of re-examine themselves. I think that those aspects really can't be underplayed, and when we look at the way that we relate to each other in society, there's a lot to be said for things that make us chill out and reconsider our own perspectives. And last but not really least, it feels good, and I think that in a lot of the pushes for decriminalization, legalization, medicalization particularly, people have a habit of, at times, losing sight of the fact that it feels good is justification enough. As human beings, I think that we have an inalienable right to alter our consciousness, particularly if you're not doing harm to other people. I can't see a good reason to disallow things. So I think it's important, especially as we advocate for the medical necessity of cannabis in certain applications. There can be a lot of merit to sort of simultaneously advocating the right to just get high, right? So that we don't fall into this sort of moralizing where substance use is only okay if you're using it for therapeutic ends. That's territory that I would rather not cede. So seeing all of these benefits, the huge question that remains is why the hell is this illegal, right? It has so much to offer, and in talking to prohibitionists, it feels like you frequently encounter folks that maybe aren't particularly familiar with the histories. So to take a brief look at why cannabis is illegal in the US, I've broken this down into a few different categories. We'll start with white supremacy, and this is a quote from Harry Anslinger, who was the former drug czar in the US, who said, "The primary reason to outlaw marijuana is its effect on the degenerate races." So there you have some insight as to the push towards criminalization, and this is back at a point where the reason, for example, with so many plants being referred to as their Latin names, yet cannabis in the States was referred to and is referred to largely as marijuana, was to push associations with Mexican immigrants and basically stoke feelings of xenophobia and racism against Mexican immigrants. So similarly, we see that there were ties to political activism and opposition to war that were associated with cannabis use. And Nixon's advisor, John Ehrlichman, actually said on the record, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." So that's pretty explicit and gives you a good sense of the degree to which politicians were willing to use drugs as political weapons against people who were using them. Similarly, we can look at this quote by Nixon, who said, "Homosexuality, dope, immorality in general are the enemies of strong society." So here you can see sort of this misogynistic language being parceled and bundled up with the notion of drug use, and sort of all of this being presented as antithetical to what Nixon saw or was publicly claiming to see as sort of the bedrock of functional society. Now, obviously, if we look historically, cross-culturally at societies around the globe, we can see that dope and drugs in a variety of forms actually create foundational components, particularly if we consider religious lineages or spiritual lineages across numerous societies. So not only are there the misogynistic components of this quote, but it also just doesn't hold in a historical context. And finally, when we look at capitalism and industrial civilization, I would contend that when we compare cannabis to things like coffee and cigarettes and amphetamines, Ritalin, things that typically get sanctioned use, cannabis isn't particularly good for the production of widgets. And, I know I've worked plenty of dead-end jobs. I would assume at least some folks here have. I know I've used cannabis through some of those jobs, not so much because it made the job better or increased my productivity for my boss, but because it was the only thing I could do to sort of make it through the endless grind of those dead-end jobs. So again, because these compounds and because the effects don't really line up with dominant culture, we see repeated attempts to suppress them. In that context, I think it's important to discuss these floating signifiers of legitimacy and authority. And by that I mean, who gets to determine what is legitimate, who is the authority determining what is legitimate, and why are they in that position? Is their position of authority reasonable, and are there grounds on which we should be listening to them? So I would contend that dominant culture and the state are ultimately predicated on coercion and violence. And by this, what I mean is that in the US, if I break the law, I expect a cop who is armed with a lethal weapon to show up as a representative of the state and essentially enforce the law, right? Tell me that if I don't behave correctly, I'm going to jail, or take me off to jail, at which point I am then locked in a cell at the mercy of people who have been deputized to use force against me, potentially, depending on the type of crime, and at times including possession of drugs, facing a death penalty, right? So there's this whole potential use of force that can be brought to bear against any of us as citizens. And I would go further and say that authority, whether we're talking about states or parents or whomever, that it's not self-justifying. So if you're going to tell somebody they can or can't do something, there has to be a legitimate reason as to why. And you should be able to unpack those dynamics and say, hey, is this justified or not? So if we think, for example, of a little, say, 4 or 5-year-old who goes to run out into the street and their parent grabs them and pulls them back, right, there's a clear, legitimate, justifiable use of force there. When it comes to cannabis, we can see that that's absolutely not the case. And because we see that cannabis wasn't criminalized by accident or based on any sort of empirical evidence, I think we can go one step further and say that ultimately it belongs in the public domain. That whether we're talking about desires to use cannabis medically or just to get high or whatever grounds we may want to use it on, I think all of those approaches are equally valid, are justifiable, and frankly, I don't think the state has any legitimate claim for interference in personal use. Additionally, to take that one step further, as we look at the corporatization of cannabis, I think that regulatory merit depends on context. So, if I should choose to grow tomatoes in my backyard, I can share those with my family. I can eat them, I can gift them. I don't really have to worry about the state saying, hey, these were grown appropriately, these were grown inappropriately. It's recognized that it's a plant that I'm capable of growing and making determinations with. When we talk about regulations with regards to cannabis, I would suggest that most of the regulatory questions have much less to do with cannabis itself than they have to do with producing goods, any goods, at an industrial scale, right? You get to questions of pesticides used, appropriate handling, how it's packaged, what's in the packaging, is it safe, as far as all of those larger scale production questions. And so as we look at these different elements of corporatization and power and authority and control, I personally don't see a way that the legal landscape as being executed at the moment presents anything beyond what I would call prohibition light. So here are a few examples of human behaviors that are, let's say, as legal as I would like to see cannabis, or as decriminalized as I would like to see cannabis, where maybe none of these are redeeming at all, and yet none of them are criminalized. So here we have somebody eating grass, we have people doing the, not the cinnamon challenge, the nutmeg challenge, somebody snorting a condom, and somebody licking a taser. Now, in the case you engaged in any of these activities whatsoever, you could say there's no redeeming merit to society at all. And yet, at no point are you ever going to encounter an armed agent of the state as a result of your choice to engage in any of these behaviors. And that's frankly what I would like to see with regards to cannabis. And I think the corporatization and current legal terrain of cannabis actually presents a fundamentally different terrain. So there was a fairly recent news article, this was actually from April 3rd, titled, "California Wages War Against Illegal Weed Farms. Governor Newsom Wants Trump to Pay for Some Costs." And in reading through the news article, what you see is that the governor of California, in the context of cannabis legalization, is actually calling for National Guard troops to be brought in to help enforce the new regulations. They're calling for expansion of law enforcement funding in order to boost the enforcement of regulatory engagement with the legal cannabis businesses, and that basically this is all happening in the context of recreational cannabis. This is all happening on a legal terrain. And to my mind, if weed is legal, then we shouldn't really be seeing huge increases in policing. That sounds antithetical to the whole point of legalization. But if we take this back to questions of dominant culture and looking at the historical reasons why cannabis was criminalized in the first place, I would suggest that rather than looking at this as, oh, they criminalized a plant and are now executing legalization poorly, we can actually see that there's a whole bunch of structural reasons why cannabis is playing out the way that it is. And so coming from the US context, I think it's really important to look at the intersection of weed and white supremacy. And there's 4 major areas that I've picked to examine. These all affect the corporatization of weed. These all affect the legal landscape. There's a whole bunch more that you could delve into, but limited time. So the 4 areas I've selected are incarceration and arrest rates, the existence of for-profit prisons and the way some of those dynamics play out, the use of zoning laws to determine where you can and can't sell or grow cannabis, and an examination of who has access to legal industry opportunities. Because it's one thing for cannabis to be legal, it's another thing for folks in the cannabis industry to be able to find significant or appropriate numbers of employees, as well as employees to be able to find jobs, should that be an industry they're looking to participate in. So as far as incarceration and arrest rates, one of the statistics that gets hammered home in the States repeatedly is that despite nearly identical rates of consumption, black folks have been nearly 4 times as likely as whites to be arrested for weed possession. Now, that's across the board. If we look at certain areas in the States which have perhaps even greater disparities in policing, we can see that those numbers are actually as high as 7.5 to 8.5 times as high for black folks than for white. So considering that the rates of consumption are the same, I would say, again, this is pointing to underlying problems of white supremacy that have very little to do with cannabis itself, but point to fundamental structures of the United States, right? The starting capital for American capitalism was secured through slavery and genocide, and American policing draws a direct lineage from Southern slave-catching gangs that actually existed for the sole purpose of returning black people who were viewed as property to their masters. So in that context, looking at for-profit prisons and arrest rates, suddenly we can see that rather than being an anomaly, this ties into a much longer history of race relations in the United States. So one of the stories that gets told is, oh, well, even though we have these dark histories, as we move into legalization, we'll start to see racial equity. We'll start to see some of these trends get addressed. I would suggest that's not the case, in part because we see that these are much longer running lineages. And sure enough, there have been a number of recent stories that have similar titles to this one, that even as states legalize marijuana, racial disparities in weed arrests persist. And this has happened across the board, as far as I'm aware. Beyond that, we can also see that there have been a number of business press articles discussing the fact that most grow operations and dispensaries are actually popping up in low-income and minority neighborhoods due to local zoning ordinances. Additionally, numerous investigational studies have probed the racial equity question and keep finding that the assertions are not matching the realities on the ground, and that even in states where there's an explosion of legal markets and options, there's still a huge incentive for black market engagement, either to move things out of the state or because prices in the state are so high or zoning regulations are so restrictive that there are considerable niches for black market growers and retailers to carve out and still make significant profits. Looking across the border briefly, I'm not super acquainted with Canada, but there have been a number of stories coming out since legalization there, indicating that the black market is thriving. A number of the cannabis or corporate actors in the cannabis space there seem to have a relationship with the business press and have been putting out numerous stories about the need to quash black market cannabis. Of course, then you talk to people who've been using cannabis in Canada for years, and they're absolutely horrified with what legal weed looks like as far as price and availability, and say, how the hell am I going to be incentivized to move to legal when I can get, black market product for a fraction of the price at much better quality? And finally, as we consider moving into this decriminalized or legalized or even just prohibition light, it's really important to my mind to acknowledge all of the wrongs and the transgressions that have played out historically. It's really important that, as NORML, the National Organization to Reform Marijuana Laws in the United States, they celebrated John Boehner, a notable politician's involvement in Acreage Holdings. Acreage Holdings is a venture capital fund that's been investing in a whole lot of cannabis industry. When he came out and supported cannabis, having now been brought on as a board member for Acreage Holdings, potentially to make significant amounts of money, NORML said, don't worry about the reasons why Boehner is now supporting cannabis. It's just important that he's supporting cannabis. Now, to me, that's not good enough, because while Boehner stands to make millions of dollars off of his position, there are tons of black, brown, and generally poorer folks who are still rotting in prison. So until we actually address those legacies of prohibition, I think it's a mistake to start cheering the people who are championing not their ability, or championing their ability to get rich, rather than any sort of equitable access to cannabis or attempt to reform these problematic justice system structures. In looking at the incarceration and arrest rates associated with weed, like I've said, we've repeatedly run across this myth of racial equity via legalization. Pretty much any way you slice it, what we've seen within the legal corporate structure has been the continued exclusion of black folks, brown folks, poorer folks from the populations that are now starting to make real money off of cannabis. Additionally, we know that incarceration impacts employment opportunities, but we're also seeing that within the terrain of legal cannabis, where there's a number of folks who have criminal records relating to cannabis and are still unable to find positions, opportunities, ability to work within the legal cannabis industry. And this is for a variety of reasons, not least of which dealing with attitudes towards criminals in the United States in the first place. And I think acknowledging the fact that, we are criminals. I know a lot of people like to play semantic games around, I'm justified in my cannabis use. I'm not doing anything wrong, therefore I'm not a criminal. Rather, I think it's important that we acknowledge that we are criminals, that cannabis is criminalized, and I think that tells us a lot about how the state views criminality, about what acts can and can't be defined as criminal, and how that ties us to other people in these various struggles. And as I pointed out earlier, the incentive to incarcerate is systemic. So in the US, we have for-profit prisons, which create financial incentives to put people in jail. However, it goes even beyond the US, right? So in the case of, say, Core Civic, which used to be known as the Corrections Corporation of America, right? These are for-profit prisons that have multiple industrial components to them. Because they're traded on the open market, right? People can invest in those corporations. So there was a recent news story on, I think it was a Canadian Teachers Association that was actually lobbying to have the financial firm that was handling their pensions divest from investing in for-profit prisons, because essentially they were all politically opposed to their pensions making money off the backs of prison labor, slave labor. Now, unfortunately, right, they had basically ceded power to this investment firm to handle those funds. So here we have this very bizarre situation where Canadian teachers, if they want to have a good pension, are basically invested in keeping nonviolent drug offenders and others locked up producing all sorts of goods in the American for-profit prison system. And the way that those things spill over borders and sort of make folks complicit in these systems of oppression, even when they want nothing to do with them, I think is incredibly important, especially when we consider, again, securing our access to cannabis, but then recognizing that this goes way beyond our access to cannabis. And to bring things back to CCA, or Core Civic, here's a quote that was stated publicly by them in addressing some of their shareholders, where they said, "Any changes with respect to drugs and controlled substances or illegal immigration could affect the number of persons arrested, convicted, and sentenced, thereby potentially reducing demand for correctional facilities to house them." So they have no problem coming out and telling you where they're at. They have no problem identifying that, nonviolent drug offenders in particular are an effective workforce. In fact, when you compare, the ease with which it's possible to incarcerate nonviolent offenders and utilize them as a slave labor force, it's actually quite preferable to incredibly violent murderers, rapists, people who've been engaged in the sort of crimes where you might think that your guards or whatever are at greater risk. Additionally, to continue the look at weed and white supremacy through the way zoning laws play out in the United States, there's this attitude, I'm sure you have it here with regards to certain things, of not in my backyard, where you have people who are advocates for a variety of technologies or protocols or social programs, but they don't want to necessarily bear the burden of having those programs or institutions in their neighborhoods. So something we've seen as various states have rolled out medical and recreational programs is that there's plenty of support for it, but especially in whiter, wealthier, more affluent neighborhoods, there are very explicit notions that they don't want to deal with the hassles of these things. So as a result, we find that the ordinances that get written mean that many of the appropriately zoned areas are actually in light industrial and mixed residential areas. These are places that are, again, usually lower income, predominantly non-white, and this creates unique pressures, right? This creates, in the event that you have police forces that are tasked with sort of making sure that the cannabis industry is towing the line and behaving appropriately. Now, in addition to whatever local police you already had in those neighborhoods, you now have additional folks who are in town ostensibly, or in that area of town ostensibly, to be checking up on these other components dealing with the cannabis industry. So you've potentially had the effect of increasing police pressures on communities that are already pretty much occupied by cops. Additionally, if we look at San Francisco, only 2% of San Francisco is zoned for cannabis, which I was really surprised to find out, particularly given, the number of people who are using. Now, there are delivery services, there are other things that, as I understand it, function within that legal framework. However, if we think about who has access to those services and where they come from, how they play out, we can see that the likelihood that 2% zoning is going to create adequate coverage for the entire populace of San Francisco, as well as tourists and anyone else, seems rather unlikely. So when we see that statistic, we should understand that there's sort of inherent black market pressures to how these plans are being rolled out. And despite seeing that those pressures are sort of baked in, there are still these nonsensical assertions that get made. This one came from a mayor in Denver who said, "Many low-income neighborhoods are next to industrial sites. That's just the lay of the land." And he was saying, basically we put cannabis businesses in there because that's how it's zoned, and the fact that these are already the distributions, well, that's just kind of how it is. But if we look historically, we see that these are neighborhoods that have historically suffered from redlining or credit rationing, where basically banks refused to give loans for development of communities. Banks were more inclined to give loans to poor white folks than even, middle class or upper class black folks, and this resulted in patterns of economic development that have led to industrial sites and mixed use being lower income neighborhoods. This didn't happen by accident. So to then map cannabis onto that and say, well, gee, this is just how it is, it sort of washes your hands and absolves you of actually addressing those broader systemic components. So as we look at the problems of prohibition light or legalization or whatever you want to call it, we can see quite clearly that legalization creates new black markets via regulation. As long as you have that regulatory imperative, there's always going to be somebody who's falling outside of the regulations. And to me, that sort of wrecked this notion that I've had since about the time I was 17 or 18 and very adamant in decriminalization and legalization as a cure to many of the ills we were seeing with cannabis. In fact, at that time, I strongly believed that cannabis prohibition was the linchpin in drug interdiction funding. Or to put it another way, if you could remove the funding for cannabis, you could essentially prevent the various drug task forces from having sufficient budgets to go after other drugs. So I thought, essentially if we could put an end to cannabis prohibition, we could see a larger end to drug prohibition. The thing that I was kind of horrified to discover as I started talking to friends who were on the ground in California and dealing with some of the absurd regulations that came into play was that they'd figured out how to sidestep that. They figured out ways to justify funding. Now, at this point, it was no longer funding for whether or not cannabis was legal, but rather on this patchy legal terrain, what sort of holes could they find to charge you for violation of, let's say, the number of plants that you had growing in your certain square footage that you were allowed to grow? Did you have too much cured and dried material? Were you distributing in ways that you weren't allowed to? Now questions come along all the time about are people diverting cannabis from legal or recreational or medicinal states to other states, or even in some of those states, whether or not people are purchasing too frequently from legal dispensaries and then doing other things with that herb. I think in particular, I have a friend who's in Occidental County, California, who was talking about the way that they rezoned things so that, or the ordinance that they put into place was one that said if you had less than 10 acres of property, you had to grow indoors or not at all. And supposedly the argument that got used for some of that was that the smell was offensive to horses, and so many people had horses on their land that they didn't want to offend the equine sensibilities. So of course this then meant that if you were growing indoor, you had to meet certain standards as far as the building that was in, and if you weren't able to set up a little greenhouse or something that could take advantage of the sunlight, you would then have to utilize the local electrical infrastructure, which ties back into a company that's been responsible for a number of wildfires due to poorly maintained infrastructure and sort of the whole mess of everything going on within society beyond your desire to just grow your little bit of weed and take care of yourself. Additionally, if we look at cannabis interdiction, we can see that there are certain components that function sort of outside of the reach of the law. Two of these that strike me as particularly relevant are civil asset forfeiture, which is where police say that goods and items being used to commit crimes essentially can be forfeited for their use in committing those crimes. So let's say you're driving along, police stop you, they find that you've got some weed in your car, they say, hey, this actually indicates you're using your car to traffic, distribute, sell weed. We're going to seize your car, and if you want it back, you have to petition us for it. Now, the petitions don't go through an actual judicial process. It's direct engagement with the police. As you might suspect, much of that property does not actually get returned. And in the case of, there have been a number of very notable cases where people have had large sums of cash, either because they've been on their way to purchase something like a car or large equipment, or that they've just, withdrawn money from the bank and the police have seized that, and it's been kind of a nightmare for folks to get their stuff back. Additionally, the smell of cannabis gets used to violate the Fourth Amendment all the time, which basically, having been on the receiving end of this, looks something along the lines of, I was driving my car, I got stopped, the police officer asserted that I had run a stop sign, he pulls me over, he did a double take, I was wearing this full Bob Marley shirt at the time, sort of stuck his head in the car after doing the double take and inhaled very audibly and deeply, and then said, sir, I'm gonna need you to stay right here, I'm calling for backup. And at the time, I wasn't a cannabis user. At the time, I knew that the assertion was ludicrous because I didn't have any weed in the car. I didn't have any weed at home. I hadn't smoked weed in months at that point. And sure enough, backup came, the dog went around the car, nobody found anything. But the degree to which that gets used as the basis for potential surveillance or incursions into people's personal private property and lives really can't be understated. And as a final point, prohibition, whether full prohibition or prohibition light, it ultimately drives non-state violence. So obviously we see all of the state violence of prohibition and incarceration, encounters with policing and all of that. But whenever we have a black market and the financial incentives that come with that, whenever we see that the value of weed is being artificially inflated through criminalization and prohibition, that also means people's willingness to take risks and commit certain types of crimes also tends to go up alongside of that. So I know that there were certain communities in Northern California that some of the growers I knew out there said that they were seeing more break-ins, more robberies, and there were actually a few murders relating to larger amounts of weed that were being ripped off by folks who were interested in flipping that based on the assumption and the claim made by the local growers was that the value had increased exponentially over a period of about 4 to 6 months, where they felt that it was more worth the risk to the people who were engaging in those types of behaviors. So that's been sort of the broader systemic problems that I see dealing with cannabis and the way that this has all been unfurled and rolled out. To take sort of a quick crash course through some of the actual corporate examples of things that are going on in specific cases, or to look at the way that the press is covering the ongoing issues. I mean, one of the big issues that comes up is the fact that the way that the regulatory terrain and the way that all of the guidelines and laws that are being passed down are being implemented within the context of corporate cannabis is that it doesn't actually create a product that is superior or more cost-effective to what's available on the black market. So as a result, we see all sorts of questions like, can legal weed ever beat the black market? We see running business series on the fact that weed is really running rampant on the black market. That despite skyrocketing number of patients being willing to file for legal medicinal cards or other avenues that have been brought out of the black market, that even despite securing legal access, many of these people are turning to the black market simply because it's cheaper, it's better quality, they have connections that are easier to deal with. I know in the Pacific Northwest, the way that they regulated edibles and the amounts of cannabis that had to be in the edibles, it was actually more effective for longtime growers and bakers to sell their edibles on the black market because of the way that it needed to be meted out in order to meet the regulatory standards. And at the point where people have been enmeshed in the black market for decades in some cases, all of those networks exist. So if there's going to be a meaningful push to push the black market out or to create a legal terrain that's actually appealing to the real long-term users of cannabis, it's going to need to address all of these issues that are making the black, or that are contributing to the black market out-competing legal weed. And Canada has dealt with this in a major way. I would contend partly because they've gone for a state monopoly and simply weren't really prepared for the various components of what that looked like. And I know there are people who couldn't believe the way that was rolled out and the way that it's led to a number of the C-suite executives in the cannabis industry essentially complaining about their competition, despite the fact that, had they sat down and talked with most people familiar with the industry, they could have laid out these problems ahead of time. Additionally, we see things like forays from all sorts of questionable investors into corporate cannabis. So there was an article on the OxyContin creator trying to get into legal weed. And I think one of the big issues that we're going to see increasing problems with, particularly as more and more people come into vaping and convenience of pre-packaged cartridges, are the intersection of cannabis and tobacco corporations. So Marlboro had purchased the e-cigarette company Juul a while back. There's also questions about the way that some of these longtime tobacco players are looking at acquiring cannabis vaping products. And in addition to questions like when we look at what happened with Juul and the use of salt nicotine rather than traditionally encountered nicotine, and sort of the adulterant effect there in an attempt to sort of create more lucrative markets via addiction, there's a really interesting story that the headline that was given was, "Did a cannabis company just patent the spliff?" And basically what the patent was for a mixture of nicotine and cannabis that's being marketed as essentially an addiction treatment for folks who have nicotine dependence. That, if we can sort of weed them off using cannabis, this is at least a step in the right direction. And really, I find this particularly concerning because even in the black market, gray market you could say now, as the cannabis concentrate cartridges have become more prevalent, the people who are doing the extractions, the people who are preparing those cartridges, the number of people have expanded. And I would contend that earlier on, the quality of some of those cartridges was very high. And I know that there have pretty much been issues since the beginning, but of late I've seen increasing numbers of stories where chemists who do a lot of these short path distillations are now finding clients are reaching out to them and saying, "Hey, we got this really funny batch of distillate, can we send it to you for analysis?" And there was a recent story where the chemist received this very weird smelling distillate and ran it through a couple different passes of chromatography or distillation, and actually found that the people who were producing this were cutting it with some unknown substance. So they had found something that they were able to mix into the distillate that would kind of dissolve into it, disappear. It made the distillate smell funny, and it smoked very weird, but it took a whole lot of effort to get that out. Now, there's a clear financial incentive if you can turn a gallon into 2 or 3 and essentially double or triple your costs. But the fact that we have, sort of the corporate players already looking to do this and explicitly acknowledging that they're looking for some of these adulterants, and seeing that pressure is playing out on both levels. This is something where it comes down to questions of analysis, of regulation. Again, not dealing with the safety of cannabis, but dealing with what things look like when you start to get into industrial manufacture and processing and producing any sort of goods at that scale. Now, on the flip side, we also see the utilization of this language around clean cannabis and adulterants and problems with that being used by the actual increasing corporate players. So right now, and this is literally as of like the last 48 hours, there's this huge back and forth going on in Michigan where the corporate players are arguing that, well, to rewind for a second, Michigan's landscape looks and has looked from the beginning like a very horizontal one, where the model was caretakers providing medicinal cannabis to their patients. So they had state-sanctioned grows and dispensaries and licenses where you would be responsible for a certain number of patients, you would be growing their medicine, you would be distributing it. Lately, there's been an influx of corporate players onto that landscape, and most recently, the corporate players are essentially suggesting that the longtime caretakers are actually not appropriately equipped to be providing this medicine. They're saying that despite any evidence, at least as far as I've seen, they're suggesting that there is a likelihood that the cannabis that is being produced is not clean, that it has fertilizers, or that it's not being appropriately flushed, or that it's just not being handled correctly. And so right now they're attempting to wage a campaign where they want all of the caretakers to basically lose their ability to function in the capacity that they have, and to switch to an atmosphere where you have to be a corporate player that has met whatever sort of regulatory components they've declared as beneficial to them. And we're seeing basically the attempts at switching over wholesale who controls the cannabis industry, right? We're looking at essentially switching from, we would be looking at switching from cooperative models of patient care into corporate, financially incentivized models to push out as much medicinal product as possible. And not to beat on this or continue to beat on it too much, but one of the major problems that's still playing out with regards to corporate cannabis is simply that of access and equitability, and the fact that when we look across the way that cannabis criminalization, decriminalization, legalization, and corporatization is playing out in the US, there's really not much being done to address the systemic problems of race and class that all of these issues have been mapped over. And like I've said, this is not unique to cannabis, and I think specifically because it's not unique to cannabis, this should identify to us that it's not enough for us to secure access to cannabis and then call it a wrap. I would suspect that most of us have experienced the wrong side of the law, for lack of a better phrase, as a result of our interest in cannabis. And that those brushes with law enforcement and that those brushes with the authoritarian power structures should make us realize that it's not good enough for us to get ourselves out of the fire and then sort of forget that there are these domineering, oppressive legal structures that become used arbitrarily against people who fall outside of what the dominant culture wants to see, and to remember that even if we do get full decriminalization or legalization, that we have solidarity with a lot of these other groups, and that it's really important for us to not lose sight of that, and that to remember that, cannabis and all of the problems associated with it, I think, go well beyond just cannabis. So thank you.
Thanks very much, David. That's an amazing amount of thought-provoking information. Thank you very much.
For sure.
We look forward to continuing the conversation over the weekend. And I must say too, I forgot to mention that David is an amazing glassmaker, and he too will be talking about that part of his, passion tomorrow. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, here's one. Wait for the microphone, sir.
Dave, great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
I I guess if those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, one comparison might be drawn with the post-prohibition world in the US, the alcohol prohibition. But it appears to me that quite a different model was applied at that time. That could just be the fact that it finished in 32, 33, I think it was. But at that time, as I understand it, wine was considered probably the most sort of culturally sort of acceptable and healthful beverage. Spirits and beer maybe slightly less so. Wine production was largely unregulated after it was legalized in terms of production, but it wasn't unregulated in terms of commerce. And then, of course, spirits and to a lesser degree beer required full license because they attracted excise. Something seems to have changed, so that in the contemporary post-cannabis prohibition model, self-production is problematic for some reason. Now, do you think that's just the domination of the corporate culture and the dominant paradigm, or do you think there's something else at work? And do you think that there might be scope to change that back to 2 plants in the backyard, fine, but don't sell it to anybody else?
Totally. I think that there's a few things going on there. I think one of the issues is definitely that question of corporate control. And I think looking at both the increasing popularity in vapes, where everything is sort of pre-packaged and ready to go. And I know there have been some memes floating around on social media showing the amount of waste from, let's say, 2 weeks of medicinal cannabis, as they have all the little baggies and the cartridges and this, that, and the other, versus sort of like the old school, you just got one Ziploc bag with your couple ounces or whatever. I think that sort of shows the level of corporate engagement that there is, right? It's not just about growing the cannabis, but it's about, you now have advertising agencies, you have packaging, you have, there's so many ways for people to make money off the industry, that I do think that pushes some of it. I think there's also a lot of sort of puritanical fear around what happens if these plants are growing in the backyard, right? Like this is the devil's lettuce. This is truly horrible stuff. Who might break into it and make use of it? And I think something that's really telling is when you look at a lot of the even the sort of legal frameworks that get put into place, where I've seen proposals that were something like you could have a canopy, a flowering canopy in a 10 by 10 space for up to something like 8 to 12 plants in one state. And yet I think they said you could have about 4 ounces of dried material, right? So like if you have, even if you don't really know what you're doing and you've got a 10 by 10 canopy, you're gonna wind up with likely more than 4 ounces. And so like the lack of knowledge around a lot of this as lawmakers sort of set the guides, I think create legal terrains that then don't function. So they say, well, look, we've created these guides, but they're not working. Perhaps this would be easier if there were corporate players because, then we set it and we know they're following and everything can be standardized and it's less of a patchwork. But I also think that a lot of this goes to the fact that there's not a clear discussion along the historical lines of why this stuff is criminalized. So you still wind up with DEA agents. The last head of the DEA made a statement that the amount of violence and incarceration we were seeing tied to cannabis was indication that the drug war was working. So when you're using all of these confused metrics and don't really have an approach that's interested in sort of taking a fact-based scientific historical analysis, it's basically a bunch of people running around with their, like chickens with their head cut off, wondering why none of this makes sense, why this doesn't align with whatever paradigm they're used to. And so I think that to whatever degree, like I would suggest, continuing to put the information out there, continuing to try to mount campaigns of sort of laying out the fact patterns, laying out the histories in pursuit of that, because I think at the end of the day, I would be much happier to see something closer to the situation you described, where if we consider, growing flower as comparable to making your own wine, and we compare that with, say, making cannabis concentrates and dabs and things like that, where you need, you know, maybe a closed loop extraction setup, and you're getting into some of those more intensive industrial processes, you know, I could understand why you may want regulations around whether or not you've purged all of the butane out of your hash oil, or things like that. So I think there's actually a lot of really good historical parallels there.
Thank you. We have another question?
Just fast forwarding, say, 5 or 10 years, if cryptocurrency is prevalent and used widespread, how do you see that being part of the transaction, or what's going to happen there?
As far as cryptos and cannabis?
Yeah, and sort of like, I guess, the black market and however, I don't know, whatever you think.
Sure. I think it's important for me to disclaim that I'm not an expert on crypto. I mean, it certainly makes it, a hell of a lot easier to transfer large sums. I mean, seeing some of the monies that were donated quite publicly to psychedelic research or other things via crypto, where whoever was donating them felt quite comfortable publicizing they were donating them because they didn't feel that they were going to be surveilled. I think that cryptocurrency probably to some extent addresses, for maybe larger scale operations, could address some of the concerns around civil asset forfeiture and ways to move money off the board. I think that crypto probably also underscores the fact that as long as there are regulatory hurdles, as long as there are these sort of prohibition light infrastructures, and as long as there are tools like crypto, or I mean even cash, right? Like crypto makes it easier to move those large sums of cash. So there's a tool that if you're operating at scale, you know, might be incredibly useful to maintaining a black market organization. And I think anything that facilitates that is going to be utilized. I would say the best combat, the best way that the government could combat those concerns about, you know, black markets and the tools to utilize them would be to go for full, you know, wholesale decriminalization, where there could be a corporate component, but where the corporations aren't set up to try to extract every last bit of value out of the industry. Because ultimately, when you're talking about a plant that can be grown really easily without too many inputs or requirements, there's no way that this is ever going to be entirely corporate controlled. And I think the sooner that the powers that be can address that, the sooner we're likely to have less of these problems of incarceration and violence and attempted state control.
If only. Any other comments or questions? Yes, just for a moment.
Can you put your presentation online?
Happily. Yeah, I guess we can put it online through the Hemp Embassy if that.
Yeah, so I guess check the Hemp Embassy website after this, and we'll have links or whatever to these. Okay, well, thank you very much, David. That was once again very thorough and very enlightening.
Thanks.
And, also